Chapter 17, Part 1 of The Quest of the Historical Jesus. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Quest of the Historical Jesus by Albert Schweitzer, translated by William Montgomery. Chapter 17, Part 1. Questions regarding the Aramaic language, rabbinic parallels, and Buddhistic influence. Bibliography. Arnold Meyer, The Mother Tongue of Jesus, Leipzig, 1896, 166 pages. Hans Lietzmann, The Son of Man, A Contribution to New Testament Theology, Freiburg, 1896, 95 pages. Julius Wellhausen, History of Israel and the Jews, 3rd edition, 1897, 4th edition, 1901, 394 pages. Gustav Dahlmann, Grammar of Jewish-Palestinian Aramaic, Leipzig, 1894. The Sayings of Jesus Considered in Connection with the Post-Canonical Jewish Writings and the Aramaic Language. Part 1, Introduction and Certain Leading Conceptions, with an Appendix on Messianic Texts, Leipzig, 1898, 309 pages. August Wundsche, A New Contribution to the Explanation of the Gospels, from Talmud and Midrash, Göttingen, 1878, 566 pages. Ferdinand Weber, System of Theology of the Ancient Palestinian Synagogue, Leipzig, 1880, 399 pages, 2nd edition, 1897. Rudolf Seidel, The Gospel of Jesus in its Relations to the Buddha Legend and the Teaching of Buddha, Leipzig, 1882, 337 pages. The Buddha Legend and the Life of Jesus in the Gospels, A New Examination of Their Mutual Relations, 2nd edition, 1897, 129 pages. Only since the appearance of Dahlmann's Grammar of Jewish-Palestinian Aramaic in 1894 have we really known what was the dialect in which the Beatitudes of the Sermon on the Mount were spoken. This work closes a discussion which had been proceeding for centuries on a line parallel to that of theology proper, and which, according to the clear description of Arnold Meyer, ran its course somewhat as follows. The question regarding the language spoken by Jesus had been vigorously discussed in the 16th century. Up till that time, no one had known what to make of the tradition recorded by Eusebius that the speech of the apostles had been Syrian, since the distinction between Syrian, Hebrew, and Chaldee was not understood, and all three designations were used indiscriminately. Light was first thrown upon the question by Joseph Justus Scaliger in 1609. In the year 1555, Johann Albrecht Wiedmanstadt, Chancellor of Ferdinand I, had published the Syriac translation of the Bible in fulfillment of the wishes of an old scholar of Bologna, Theseus Ambrosius, who had left him the manuscript as a sacred legacy. He himself and his contemporaries believed that in this they had the gospel in the mother tongue of Jesus, until Scaliger, in one of his letters, gave a clear sketch of the Syrian dialects, distinguished Syriac from Chaldee, and further drew a distinction between the Babylonian Chaldee and Jewish Chaldee of the Targums, and in the language of the Targums itself distinguished an earlier from a later stratum. The apostles spoke, according to Scaliger, a Galilean dialect of Chaldaic, or, according to the more correct nomenclature introduced later, following a suggestion of Scaliger's, a dialect of Aramaic, and in addition to that, the Syriac of Antioch. Next, Hugo Grotius put in a strong plea for a distinction between Jewish and Antiochian Syriac. Into the confusion caused at that time by the use of the term Hebrew, some order was introduced by the Leiden Calvinistic professor Claude Saumace, who, writing in French, emphasized the point that the New Testament and the early fathers, when they speak of Hebrew, mean Syriac, since Hebrew had become completely unknown to the Jews of that period. Brian Walton, the editor of the London Polyglot, which was completed in 1657, supposed that the dialect of Onkelos and Jonathan was the language of Jesus, being under the impression that both these Targums were written in the time of Jesus. The growing knowledge of the distinction between Hebrew and Aramaic did not prevent the Vienna Jesuit Inkofer in 1648 from maintaining that Jesus spoke Latin. The Lord cannot have used any other language upon earth, since this is the language of the saints in heaven. On the Protestant side, Vossius, opposing Richard Simon, endeavored to establish the thesis that Greek was the language of Jesus, being partly inspired by the apologetic purpose of preventing the authenticity of the discourses and sayings of Jesus from being weakened by supposing them to have been translated from Aramaic into Greek, but also rightly recognizing the importance which the Greek language must have assumed at that time in northern Palestine, through which there passed such important trade routes. This view was brought up again by the Neapolitan legal scholar Dominicus Diodati in his book De Christo Gratia Loquente, 1767, who added some interesting material concerning the importance of the Greek language at the period and in the native district of Jesus. But 5 years later, in 1772, this view was thoroughly refuted by Gianbernardo de Rossi, who argued convincingly that among a people so separate and so conservative as the Jews, the native language cannot possibly have been wholly driven out. The apostles wrote Greek for the sake of foreign readers. In the year 1792, Johann Adrian Bolton, first collegiate pastor at the principal church in Altona, made the first attempt to retranslate the sayings of Jesus into the original tongue. The certainly original Greek of the epistles and the Johannine literature was a strong argument against the attempt to recognize no language save Aramaic as known to Jesus and his disciples. Paulus the rationalist, therefore, sought a middle path, and explained that while the Aramaic dialect was indeed the native language of Jesus, Greek had become so generally current among the population of Galilee, and still more of Jerusalem, that the founders of Christianity could use this language when they found it needful to do so. His Catholic contemporary, Hug, came to a similar conclusion. In the course of the 19th century, Aramaic, known down to the time of Michaelis as Chaldee, was more thoroughly studied. The various branches of this language and the history of its progress became more or less clearly recognizable. Couch's Grammar of Biblical Aramaic, from 1884, and Dahlmann's work embody the result of these studies. Explains Meyer, quote, "The Aramaic language is a branch of the North Semitic, the linguistic stock to which also belongs the Assyrio-Babylonian language in the east, and the Canaanitish languages, including Hebrew, in the west, while the South Semitic languages, the Arabic and Ethiopic, form a group by themselves. The users of these languages, the Arameans, were seated in historic times between the Babylonians and Canaanites, the area of their distribution extending from the foot of Lebanon and Hermon in the northeasterly direction, as far as Mesopotamia, where Aram of the two rivers forms their easternmost province. Their immigration into these regions forms a third epoch of the Semitic migrations, which probably lasted from 1600 BC down to 600. The Aramaic states had no great stability. The most important of them was the kingdom of Damascus, which, at a certain period, was so dangerous an enemy to northern Israel. In the end, however, the Aramean dynasties were crushed, like the two Israelitish kingdoms, between the upper and nether millstones of Babylon and Egypt. In the time of the successors of Alexander, there arose in these regions the Syrian kingdom, which in turn gave place to the Roman power. But linguistically, the Arameans conquered the whole of Western Asia. In the course of the first millennium BC, Aramaic became the language of commerce and diplomacy, as Babylonian had been during the second. It was only the rise of Greek as a universal language which put a term to these conquests of the Aramaic. In the year 701 BC, Aramaic had not yet penetrated into Judea.
When the Rabshakeh, or officer, sent by Sennacherib, addressed the envoys of Hezekiah in Hebrew, they begged him to speak Aramaic, in order that the men upon the wall might not understand. For the post-exilic period, the Aramaic edicts of the book of Ezra and inscriptions on Persian coins show that throughout wide districts of the new empire, Aramaic had made good its position as the language of common intercourse. Its domain extended from the Euxine southwards as far as Egypt, and even into Egypt itself. Samaria and the Hauran adopted it. Only the Greek towns and Phoenicia resisted. The influence of Aramaic upon Jewish literature begins to be noticeable about the year 600. Jeremiah and Ezekiel, writing in a foreign land in an Aramaic environment, are the first witnesses to its supremacy. In the northern part of the country, owing to the immigration of foreign colonists after the destruction of the northern kingdom, it had already gained a hold upon the common people. In the book of Daniel, written in the year 167 BC, the Hebrew and Aramaic languages alternate. Perhaps, indeed, we ought to assume an Aramaic ground document as the basis of this work. At what time Aramaic became the common popular speech in the post-exilic community, we cannot exactly discover. Under Nehemiah, Judean, that is to say, Hebrew, was still spoken in Jerusalem. In the time of the Maccabees, Aramaic seems to have wholly driven out the ancient national tongue. Evidence for this is to be found in the occurrence of Aramaic passages in the Talmud, for which it is evident that the rabbis used this language in the religious instruction of the people. The provision that the text, after being read in Hebrew, should be interpreted to the people may quite well reach back into the time of Jesus. The first evidence for this practice is in the Mishnah, about AD 150. In the time of Jesus, 3 languages met in Galilee: Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. In what relation they stood to each other we do not know, since Josephus, the only writer who could have told us, fails us on this point, as he so often does elsewhere. He informs us that when acting as an envoy of Titus, he spoke to the people of Jerusalem in the ancestral tongue, and the word he uses is Hebraizon. But the very thing we should like to know, whether, namely, this language was Aramaic or Hebrew, he does not tell us. We are left in the same uncertainty by the passage in Acts chapter 22, verse 2, which says that Paul spoke to the people Hebraidi dialecto, thereby gaining their attention, for there is no indication whether the language was Aramaic or Hebrew. For the writers of that period, Hebrew simply means Jewish. We cannot, therefore, be sure in what relation the ancient Hebrew sacred language and the Aramaic of ordinary intercourse stood to one another as regards religious writings and religious instruction. Did the ordinary man merely learn by heart a few verses, prayers, and psalms? Or was Hebrew, as the language of the cultus, also current in wider circles? Dahlmann gives a number of examples of works written in Hebrew in the century which witnessed the birth of Christ. He says, quote, "A Hebrew original must be assumed in the case of the main part of the Ethiopic book of Enoch, the Assumption of Moses, the Apocalypse of Baruch, 4th Ezra, the Book of Jubilees, and for the Jewish ground document of the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs, of which M. Gaster has discovered a Hebrew manuscript." Close quote. The first book of Maccabees, too, seems to him to go back to a Hebrew original. Nevertheless, he holds it to be impossible that synagogue discourses intended for the people can have been delivered in Hebrew, or that Jesus taught otherwise than in Aramaic. Franz Delitzsch's view, on the other hand, is that Jesus and the disciples taught in Hebrew, and that is the opinion of Resch also. Adolf Neubauer, reader in rabbinical Hebrew at Oxford, attempted a compromise. It was certainly the case, he thought, that in the time of Jesus Aramaic was spoken throughout Palestine, but whereas in Galilee this language had an exclusive dominance, and the knowledge of Hebrew was confined to texts learned by heart, in Jerusalem Hebrew had renewed itself by the adoption of Aramaic elements,
and a kind of Neo-Hebraic language had arisen. This solution at least testifies to the difficulty of the question. The fact is, from the language of the New Testament, it is often difficult to make out whether the underlying words are Hebrew or Aramaic. Thus, for instance, Dahlmann remarks, with reference to the question whether the statement of Papias refers to a Hebrew or an Aramaic primitive Matthew, that it is difficult, quote, to produce proof of an Aramaic as distinct from a Hebrew source, because it is often the case in biblical Hebrew, and still more often in the idiom of the Mishnah, that the same expressions and forms of phrase are possible as in Aramaic. Close quote. Delitzsch's retranslation of the New Testament into Hebrew is therefore historically justified. But the question about the language of Jesus must not be confused with the main problem of the original language of the primitive form of Matthew's Gospel. In reference to the later, Dahlmann thinks that the tradition of the early church regarding an earlier Aramaic form of the Gospel must be considered as lacking confirmation. Quote, it is only in the case of Jesus' own words that an Aramaic original form is undeniable, and it is only for these that early church tradition asserted the existence of a Semitic documentary source. It is, therefore, the right and duty of biblical scholarship to investigate the form which the sayings of Jesus must have taken in the original, and the sense which in this form they must have conveyed to Jewish hearers. Close quote. That Jesus spoke Aramaic, Meyer has shown by collecting all the Aramaic expressions which occur in his preaching. He considers the Abba in Gethsemane decisive, for this means that Jesus prayed in Aramaic in his hour of bitterest need. Again, the cry from the cross was, according to Mark chapter 15, verse 34, also Aramaic. Heloi, Heloi, lama sabachthani. The Old Testament was therefore most familiar to him in an Aramaic translation. Otherwise, this form of the psalm passage would not have come to his lips at the moment of death. It is a quite independent question whether Jesus could speak or at least understand Greek. According to Josephus, the knowledge of Greek in Palestine at that time, even among educated Jews, can only have been of a quite elementary character. He himself had to learn it laboriously in order to be able to write in it. His Jewish War was first written in Aramaic for his fellow countrymen. The Greek edition was, by his own avowal, not intended for them. In another passage, it is true, he seems to imply a knowledge of and interest in foreign languages even among people in humble life. An analogy, which is in many respects very close to the linguistic conditions in Palestine, was offered by Alsace under French rule in the 60s of the 19th century. Here, too, three languages met in the same district. The High German of Luther's translation of the Bible was the language of the Church. The Alemannic dialect was the usual speech of the people, while French was the language of culture and of government administration. This remarkable analogy would be rather in favor, if analogy can be admitted to have any weight in the question, of Delitzsch and Resch, since the biblical High German, although never spoken in social intercourse, strongly influenced the Alemannic dialect, although this was, on the other hand, quite uninfluenced by modern High German, but did not allow it to penetrate into church or school, there maintaining for itself an undivided sway. French made some progress, but only in certain circles, and remained entirely excluded from the religious sphere. The Alsatians of the poorer classes, who could at that time have repeated the Lord's Prayer or the Beatitudes in French, would not have been difficult to count. The Lutheran translation still holds its own to some extent against the French translation, with the older generation of the Alsatian community in Paris, which has in other respects become completely French. So strong is the influence of a former ecclesiastical language even among those who have left their native home. There is one factor, however, which is not represented in the analogy, the influence of the Greek-speaking Jews of the diaspora, who gathered to the feasts at Jerusalem, upon the extension of the Greek language in the mother country. Jesus, then, spoke Galilean Aramaic, which is known to us as a separate dialect from writings of the 4th to the 7th century. For the Judean dialect we have more and earlier evidence. We have literary monuments in it from the 1st to the 3rd century. Dahlmann thinks, quote, "It is very probable that the popular dialect of northern Palestine, after the final fall of the Judean center of the Aramaic Jewish culture, which followed on the Bar Kokhba rising, spread over almost the whole of Palestine." Close quote. The retranslations into Aramaic are therefore justified. After J. A. Bolton's attempt had remained for nearly 100 years the only one of its kind, the experiment had been renewed in our own time by J. T. Marshall, E. Nestle, J. Wellhausen, Arnold Meyer, and Gustav Dahlmann. In the case of Marshall and Nestle, with the subsidiary purpose of endeavoring to prove the existence of an Aramaic documentary source. These retranslations first attracted their due meed of attention from theologians in connection with the Son of Man question. Rarely, if ever, have theologians experienced such a surprise as was sprung upon them by Hans Lietzmann's essay of 1896. Jesus had never, so ran the thesis of the Bonn candidate in theology, applied himself the title Son of Man, because in the Aramaic the title did not exist, and on linguistic grounds could not have existed. In the language which he used, the Aramaic for Son of Man was merely a periphrasis for a man. That Jesus meant himself when he spoke of the Son of Man, none of his hearers could have suspected. Lietzmann had not been without predecessors. Gilbert Genebrard, who died Archbishop of Aix as long ago as 1597, had emphasized the point that the term Son of Man should not be interpreted with reference solely to Christ, but to the race of mankind. Hugo Grotius maintained the same position even more emphatically. With a quite modern one-sidedness, Paulus the Rationalist maintained in his commentaries and in his Life of Jesus, that according to Ezekiel chapter 2, verse 1, Barnash meant man in general. Jesus, he thought, whenever he used the expression the Son of Man, pointed to himself, and thus gave it the sense of this man. In taking this line, he gives up the general reference to mankind as a whole, for which Mark chapter 2, verse 28 is generally cited as the classical passage. The suggestion that the term Son of Man, in its apocalyptic signification, was first attributed to Jesus at a later time, and that the passages where it occurs in this sense are therefore suspicious, was first put forward by Fray August Fritzsche. He hoped in this way to get rid of Matthew chapter 10, verse 23. De Lagarde, like Paulus, emphatically asserted that Son of Man only meant man. But instead of the clumsy explanation of the rationalist, he gave another and a more pleasing one, namely, that Jesus, by choosing this title, designed to ennoble mankind. Wellhausen, in his History of Israel and of the Jews, from 1894, remarked on it as strange that Jesus should have called himself the man. B. D. Erdmans, taking the apocalyptic significance of the term as his starting point, attempted to carry out consistently the theory of the later interpolation of this title into the sayings of Jesus. Thus, Lietzmann had predecessors, but they were not so in any real sense. They had either started out from the Markan passage where the Son of Man is described as the Lord of the Sabbath, and endeavored arbitrarily to interpret all the Son of Man passages in the same sense, or they assumed without sufficient grounds that the title Son of Man was a later interpolation. The new idea consisted in combining the two attempts, and declaring the passages about the Son of Man to be linguistically and historically impossible, seeing that, on linguistic grounds, Son of Man means man. Arnold Meyer and Wellhausen expressed themselves in the same sense as Lietzmann. The passages where Jesus uses the expression in an unmistakably messianic sense are, according to them, to be put down to the account of early Christian theology. The only passages which, in their opinion, are historically tenable are the 2 or 3 in which the expression denotes man in general, or is equivalent to the simple I. These latter were felt to be a difficulty by the Church when it came to think in Greek, since this way of speaking of oneself was strange to them. Consequently, the expression appeared to them deliberately enigmatic and only capable of being interpreted in the sense which it bears in Daniel. The Son of Man conception, argued Lietzmann, when he again approached the question 2 years later, had arisen in a Hellenistic environment, on the basis of Daniel chapter 7 verse 13. And Schmidt, too, saw in the apocalyptic Bar Nasha passages which follow the revelation of the Messiahship at Caesarea Philippi, an interpolation from the later apocalyptic theology. On the other hand, P. Schmiedel still wished to make it a messianic designation, and to take it as being historical in the sense even in passages in which the term man gave a possible sense. H. Gunkel thought that it was possible to translate Bar Nasha simply by man, and nevertheless hold to the historicity of the expression as a self-designation of Jesus. Jesus, he suggests, had borrowed this enigmatic term, which goes back to Daniel chapter 7 verse 13, from the mystical apocalyptic literature, meaning thereby to indicate that he was the man of God, in contrast to the man of sin. Holtzmann felt a kind of relief in handing over to the philologists the obstinate problem which, since the time of Baltensperger and Weiss, had caused so much trouble to theologians, and wanted to postpone the historical discussion until the Aramaic experts had settled the linguistic question. That happened sooner than was expected. In 1898, Dahlmann declared in his epoch-making work Die Worte Jesu that he could not admit the linguistic objections to the use of the expression Son of Man by Jesus. He says, quote, "Biblical Aramaic does not differ in this respect from Hebrew. The simple Aramaic for man, and not the Aramaic son for man, is the term for man." Close quote. It was only later that the Jewish Galilean dialect, like the Palestinian Christian dialect, used Aramaic son of man for man, though in both idioms the simple Aramaic for man occurs in the sense of someone. He continues, quote, "In view of the whole facts of the case, what has to be said is that Jewish Palestinian Aramaic of the earlier period used Aramaic for man, and occasionally to designate a plurality of men makes use of the expression Aramaic for sons of man. The singular Aramaic son of man was not current, but was only used in imitation of the Hebrew text of the Bible, where Aramaic son of man belongs to the poetic diction, and is, moreover, not of very frequent occurrence." Close quote. He says elsewhere, quote, "It is by no means a sign of a sound historical method, instead of working patiently at the solution of the problem, to hasten, like Urt and Lietzmann, to the conclusion that the absence of the expression in the New Testament epistles is a proof that Jesus did not use it either, but that there was somewhere or other a Hellenistic community in the early church which had a predilection for this name, and often made Jesus speak of himself in the gospel narrative in the third person, in order to find an opportunity of bringing it in. So the oxen turned back with the ark into the land of the Philistines. It was a case of returning to the starting point, and deciding on historical grounds in what sense Jesus had used the expression. But the possibilities were reduced by the way in which Lietzmann had posed the problem, since the interpretations according to which Jesus had used it in a veiled ethical messianic sense, to indicate the ethical and spiritual transformation of all the eschatological conceptions, were now manifestly incapable of offering any convincing argument against the radical denial of the use of the expression. Baltensperger rightly remarked in a review of the whole discussion, that the question which was ultimately at stake in the combat over the title Son of Man was the question whether Jesus was the Messiah or no, and that Dahlmann, by his proof of its linguistic possibility, had saved the Messiahship of Jesus. But what kind of messiahship? Is it any other kind than the future messiahship of the apocalyptic Son of Man, which Johannes Weiss had asserted? Did Jesus mean anything different by the Son of Man from that which was meant by the apocalyptic writers? To put it otherwise, behind the Son of Man problem, there lies the general question whether Jesus can have described himself as the present Messiah. For the fundamental difficulty is that he, a man upon earth, should give himself out to be the Son of Man, and at the same time apparently give to that title a quite different sense from that which it previously possessed. The champion of the linguistic possibility of this self-designation made the last serious attempt to render the transformation of the conception historically conceivable. He argues that Jesus cannot have used it as a mere meaningless expression, a periphrasis for the simple I. On the other hand, the term cannot have been understood by the disciples as an exalted title, or at least only in the sense that the title indicative of exaltation is paradoxically connected with the title indicative of humility. Quote, "We shall be justified in saying that, for the synoptic evangelists, man's son was no title of honor for the Messiah, but, as it must necessarily appear to a Hellenist, a veiling of his messiahship under a name which emphasizes the humanity of its bearer." Close quote. For them, it was not the references to the sufferings of man's son that were paradoxical, but the references to his exaltation. That man's son should be put to death is not wonderful. What is wonderful is his coming again upon the clouds of heaven. If Jesus called himself the Son of Man, the only conclusion which could be drawn by those that heard him was, quote, that for some reason or other he desired to describe himself as a man par excellence. Close quote. There is no reason to think of the heavenly Son of Man, of the similitudes of Enoch and 4th Ezra. That conception could hardly be present to the minds of its auditors. Quote, "How was one who was now walking upon the earth to come from heaven? How would he have needed first to be translated thither? One who had died or been rapt away from earth might be brought back to earth again in this way, or a being who had never before been upon earth might be conceived as descending thither." Close quote. But if, on the one hand, the title Son of Man was not to be understood apart from the reference to the passage in Daniel, while, on the other, Jesus so designated himself as a man actually present upon earth, quote, what was really implied was that he was the man in whom Daniel's vision of one like unto a Son of Man was being fulfilled. Close quote. He could not certainly expect from his hearers a complete understanding of the self-designation. Quote, "We are doubtless justified in saying that in using it, he intentionally offered them an enigma which challenged further reflection upon his person." Close quote. According to Peter's confession, the name was intelligible to the disciples as coming from Daniel chapter 7 verse 13, and obviously indicating him who was destined to the sovereignty of the world. Jesus calls himself the Son of Man, quote, not as meaning the lowly one, but as a scion of the human race with its human weakness, whom, nevertheless, God will make Lord of the world. And it is very probable that Jesus found the Son of Man of Daniel chapter 7 in Psalm chapter 8 verse 5 and following also. Close quote. Sayings regarding humiliation and suffering could be attached to the title just as well as references to exaltation. For since the Child of Man has placed himself upon the throne of God, he is in reality no longer a mere man, but ruler over heaven and earth, the Lord. This attempt of Dahlmann's has the same significance in regard to the question of the Messiahship as Bousset's had for the ethical question. Just as in Bousset's view, the kingdom of God was, in a paradoxical way, after all proclaimed as present, so here the self-designation Son of Man is retained by a paradox as conveying the sense of a present Messiahship. But the documents do not give any support to this assumption. On the contrary, they do contradict it at every point. According to Dahlmann, It is not the predictions of the passion of the Son of Man which sounded paradoxical to the disciples, but the predictions of his exaltation. But we are distinctly told that when he spoke of his passion, they did not understand the saying. The predictions of his exaltation, however, they understood so well that without troubling themselves further about the predictions of the sufferings, they began to dispute who should be greatest in the kingdom of heaven, and who should have his throne closest to the Son of Man. And if it is once admitted that Jesus took the designation from Daniel, what ground is there for asserting that the purely eschatological transcendental significance which the term had taken on in the similitudes of Enoch, and retains in 4th Ezra, had no existence for Jesus? Thus, by a long roundabout, criticism has come back to Johannes Weiss. His eschatological solution of the Son of Man question, the elements of which are to be found in Strauss's first Life of Jesus, is the only possible one. Dahlmann expresses the same idea in the form of a question. Quote, "How could one who was actually walking the earth come down from heaven? He would first have needed to be translated thither. One who had died or been rapt away from earth might possibly be brought back to earth in this way." Close quote. Having reached this point, we have only to observe further that Jesus, from the confession of Peter onwards, always speaks of the Son of Man in connection with death and resurrection. That is to say, that once the disciples know in what relation he stands to the Son of Man, he uses this title to suggest the manner of his return. As the sequel to his death and resurrection, he will return to the world again as a superhuman personality. Thus, the purely transcendental use of the term suggested by Dahlmann as a possibility turns out to be the historical reality. End of chapter 17, part 1.